Hi, I'm Charlotte Clark. I am the co founder of Navigate Education, and we're going to spend about an hour talking about emotional safety and the impact that has on children and young people's behaviour. We're going to start by talking about why children and young people have changed. I'm lucky enough to spend quite a lot of my time in schools, and um, people are exhausted. It is overwhelming. There are lots of challenges. There is a higher level of need. And we hear lots of things like children being manipulative, young people being entitled. We hear the word disrespectful a lot. And I get it feels like that. I'm not silly enough to say that things haven't changed. And what I don't want to do is talk about why we shouldn't hold boundaries or protect ourselves as adults in schools. We're going to start just by looking at the why, because understanding why children and young people have changed will help us understand how we hold those boundaries in a way that is effective and emotionally safe for everybody. So let's look at what has impacted our children and young people. Why are things different? And there are a few things we're going to talk through. Let's start by thinking about phones and devices. So, phones do a couple of things, I think. So, the first one is that the blue light that comes off of our phones and devices is addictive. It creates a dependency. And children and young people that spend more than 2 hours on a device will be in blue light withdrawal anytime they're not in front of a screen. And I used to think maybe that was just something for older children. Like I know that my teenagers rack up 2 hours a day on a device before break time. But actually, if you go down the high street, if you pop your head out of the door at pickup, you will see toddlers in pushchairs on phones, and they might be watching rhyme time. It's not that it's necessarily inappropriate content, but if we're channeling it through phones or tablets, it's creating that blue light withdrawal. So, one of the first things we can do in our parent engagement or newsletter, let families know they can turn that blue light off. It is in the accessibility features in our devices. It will make our phones look slightly different, but takes that blue light and dependency off. Children that are withdrawing from blue light present behaviors that are really similar to children and young people that have ADHD. And you probably feel that in your settings at the moment. That dysregulation, challenges to engage and focus. Let's think about what else happens with phones and devices. I used to be really worried about the amount of notifications, that constantly being surrounded by friends and noise. I was always really keen to get on the school bus and get away from school, to have that evening and connection to reset with my family and go again the next day. And my children definitely don't have that. But I was talking to my son about a mufti day when I realized that actually the phones play a different role that I perhaps hadn't considered. So when I had a own clothes day or whatever at school, my mum and dad gave me the very best in two-stripe Adidas joggers and a Jimmy Hilfiger gilet that I wore with pride. And I got all the way to school. I got all the way to school thinking that I looked great and my mum and dad had gone out of their way to kit me out. I was explaining to my son that I was ever so thankful that there weren't pictures or memes or whatever it is that people put on TikTok or Snapchat or wherever they put them, of me looking silly in my fake market knockoff gear. But then I realized I got to school without realizing. I had that journey thinking that I looked great. My mum and dad told me that only caravan sites opened at Easter, and I believed them. That's a big difference, isn't it? Because today, my son knows the price of the trainers that the boy down the road that we've never even met wears to rugby. So if I work hard and buy a pair of trainers that are £150, which I think is extortionate, he immediately feels shortchanged because the kid down the road has a pair that's £220 and they're not even for best. That comparison is really damaging for children and young people. And what's important to think about is our brains grow to size by the time we're 5. It takes another 20 years for our neural connections and pathways to wire up, for us to understand who we are, where we sit in the world. As our children and young people are doing that, as they're learning who they are and how the world works, that comparison teaches them to behave in ways that we might not understand. Other things to think about that influence that wiring up are how we've changed our perception of risk in the real world and yet take so few protective measures in the online world. When we post an image that can make us popular and get all of that instant gratification in likes and shares and comments in an instant, but we could also post a picture that gets us rejected from our groups, that means that we are blocked, that we are removed and lose our social status in the same instance. It means that we start to see relationships as really high risk. They're fast paced and low investment. That has an impact on how we build our relationships in the real world. It has an impact on how we build relationships with adults. Other things that have changed, let's think about families. I work from home. Sometimes that's a luxury. Certainly when I thought about it, I'd imagine that I would have homemade snacks and crafting activities ready to go when my kids came home from school. The reality is I'm normally on my laptop. I normally do a bit of this when they come in. I normally don't give them my attention until it's that horrible witching hour where everybody's bored and needs to be fed. What do we think we teach children about how to get their rope picked up? If we were to imagine every child and young person holding a rope and what they need to feel safe, to feel secure, to matter, is that an adult picks the other end of the rope up, giving them their undivided attention. How do we think children learn how to get that rope picked up at home? Because I know if my children come home, if they put their bags on the peg, if they go to the cupboard, if they get a healthy snack and they go and do something quietly, I carry on. I carry on working or scrolling through Instagram or doing whatever I'm doing. If my kids come home, leave their shoes on and go in the cupboard and get the mint aero I'm saving for Coronation Street, I don't care who I'm speaking to or what I'm doing. I'll shut my laptop and say to them, "What do you think you're doing?" How does that play out in your setting? How do your children and young people get the rope picked up? We also need to think about how all of these things, that blue light withdrawal, the comparison, the change in human connection and attention, is changing our sponge space. So this part here, our prefrontal cortex, I think of it as a sponge. And if we were to go back 5 or 10 years, our sponge had lots more space. And that sponge needs to have space in it for us to be able to think, to reflect, to learn. And so 5 or 10 years ago, we would be able to make our children and young people feel embarrassed, a bit ashamed, on high alert, a bit scared. And that arousal or extra emotion would take up some sponge space, but we would still have capacity to learn, to recognize that I did this and it created a response that I didn't enjoy. So I'm going to reflect and not do that again. That whole chain sequence of events could happen without us becoming dysregulated, without us using up all of our sponge space and it shutting off. Because when our sponge is at capacity, it shuts off and we have 15 minutes where we are governed by our brainstem down here, which is anger and impulse. It means we cannot learn, we cannot reflect. The challenge we have now is that our sponges are so full that if we use shame, if we make children feel embarrassed or scared or on high alert when we are holding our boundaries, it simply uses the last bit of sponge space and tips them into dysregulation. So, what we want to do is think about how we hold those boundaries without compromising the sponge space. What else can we think about? I want to talk about endurance weekends. So I've got a nice house, a reasonably nice car. I go on holiday. I wouldn't come with any indicators of needing financial support, but probably in the last year, maybe two, I run out of money at the end of every month. We have a weekend where going to the cinema or going bowling or going out for dinner is off the cards. I've got 3 children and doing just about anything costs £100. There are weekends that we don't have £100 anymore. Yes, we pay our bills. Yes, we're doing okay, but we do it by the skin of our teeth. So what do you think we do during endurance weekends? Because again, I'd love to say we do activities, we play Monopoly. We don't. Somebody said to me, I was delivering a keynote in person not so long ago, and somebody said to me, you should go for a walk. I took my children for a walk. I live in Surrey. We went to Richmond Riverside. It is £6.50 for a 99 on the Riverside in Richmond. So I'd spent 20 quid on ice cream, nearly 20 quid on parking to walk along and have my children say to me, where are we going? Also, if I'm being completely honest, life is tiring. We're juggling huge pressures, financial stresses, the parents' WhatsApp group, which is like a full-time job. If I have an endurance weekend, I feel a bit annoyed that I've worked really hard and have no money. So what I want to do is sit and catch up on Coronation Street in peace. And if I give my children Lego or crafts, they keep talking to me. If I give them their tablet, I might have to nudge them in 4 hours to remind them to eat and go to the toilet. What does that all mean? How does that pan out in your school? Can you tell the children that have spent a long time on devices over the weekend? Is there anything you could do to break up those endurance weekends? If you've got a hall and a screen, you could do a film night. How can you get them in and break up that space? It won't change the world, but you might see a more settled, regulated learner community come in on the Monday. The final thing we're going to talk about, maybe two. Let's talk about entitlement first. So lots of people describe children and young people as entitled. I experienced that recently when my daughter started a job. She read her employment contract from start to finish, which is something new. She got a 20-minute break and she took it. And it wouldn't have mattered what was happening. My daughter would have been sat scrolling through her phone. And I said to her, that's not really how the world of work works. You should be using your initiative and you should be getting ahead. And she said, I'm not working for those 20 minutes. I'm not being paid. It's not my responsibility. I'm on my break. And for me, that's really different to how I grew up. It's really different to what I believe is being a good team player and getting ahead and showing initiative. A few weeks later, she told me that she'd made a a complaint to HR about people speaking to her in ways that was inappropriate. And I found it challenging because she'd had a few people make comments about her appearance and she felt uncomfortable about that. She didn't want that in her workspace. And she went and spoke to HR. And intuitively, I thought that was a bit much. To her and to most of the other children and young people we work with, she has grown up in a time where she has seen that there are not adults who hold boundaries for children and young people, that not all adults in positions of authority should be trusted and do the right thing. She's grown up seeing Me Too campaign, Black Lives Matter, the pandemic, Trump and his many decisions play out. So she believes that if you don't hold your boundaries at the thin end of the wedge, nobody will hold them for you. Her speaking, her using her voice isn't about confidence. It's not entitlement. That's what she's learned she needs to do to survive. And we as adults need to learn how to respond to children and young people where they are, not where we were, because their lives and their development is fundamentally different. The last thing I'm going to talk about is emotional literacy. Because when my 7-year-old daughter comes home after a tricky day, I am aware that if I had gone home and used the same language, my mum would have phoned the police and an ambulance at the same time. My daughter can use very big words. It's a wonderful thing. But it's tricky as a parent to remember to tune in. What does it mean when she comes home and says she's been bullied, that everybody's been mean, that she feels anxious? They aren't things that we're used to hearing from young children, but it is language that young children are learning. So it's really good to help your parents to understand what they might hear and why. My daughter had just had a fallout about who picked what game in the playground. That's tricky for her. She needs some support. But perhaps the language she used would have put me on high alert if I'd not stopped twice to think. So, with all of that, let's think about what we need to do. We need to be calm and predictable and safe as adults. That is different to simply having a good relationship with children and young people. I know that in recent years, we have heard lots about the importance of relationships. And I just want to distinguish the difference between having good relationships as part of learning and using relationships for behavior management. So, my issue with relationships is that when we give something, we expect something back. That is human nature. And if we are asking our adults not to do that, we are setting them up for fail. So, if I go to the effort of learning what your favourite football team is, what you do at the weekend, if I comment on your hair, if I look the other way as you roll your shirt up, my expectation is that you are going to give something back to me. And the expectation is often that you're going to sit in my lesson, enjoy my learning, and behave just as I expect. That's not how this works. And when that back doesn't come, what we end up doing as adults is starting to feel resentful. We get frustrated. We move along that pendulum where we start really trying, really giving, being really nice, trying to look at behavior through a lens of communication, and then starting to feel a bit annoyed and then a bit frustrated. And then before we know it, we're going back to the things we've always done and saying the things we've always said. That pendulum, that inconsistency does not teach children and young people that they have adults that care about them who are human. It does not teach them that we are trying our best and expect them to as well. It teaches them to be on high alert. It says This is unpredictable. I'm not safe. I don't know where I stand. So, what we need to do is learn how to walk down the middle, to be predictable and clear, to hold expectations, but do that whilst building belonging, to address, learn a behavior without engaging our emotions. I'm not saying that schools should not be nice and we should not have relationships with the children and young people we serve. But I am saying that relationships are not the lever for positive behavior and make it much harder for adults to access the behaviors that are emotionally safe. So I don't need you to take my word for it. Before we look at how we do this, I'm just going to talk about my friend Maureen McKenna. She was formerly the Director of Education in Glasgow, and you will see that she reduced suspensions and exclusions by 94%. You might look at the graph and think, I'm glad I don't work in them schools. And I guess reducing suspensions and exclusions on its own could be seen as easy. You could think they're just classrooms where perhaps learning isn't happening. But at the same time, as reducing suspensions and exclusions by 94%, she also tripled levels of attainment. The number of children and young people going on to further education in Glasgow at the same time quadrupled. And she says, when she talks about her leadership as Director of Education, she will say one of the things she is most proud of is that today Glasgow is becoming homegrown. If you have a doctor, a social worker, a lawyer in Glasgow, they are likely to be somebody that was born, bred, and used services in Glasgow. When I first met Maureen, I was lucky to spend some time in schools around Glasgow. She picked me up from the station. I was a bit nervous. She's got all sorts of honours and is very well respected. So I'd spent the train journey getting myself worked up. When I came out of the station, I was looking for a nice car. I phoned her and she said, Oh, I'm just in the little, I'm not sure what it was, a very small, looked quite old car. And I thought, that's odd. So I said to her, Maureen, what's with the car? And she said, I've grown to love this. When I first got the role as Director of Education, people used to throw eggs at me. When I first said we were going to reduce suspensions and exclusions and I was not going to remove children and young people from learning unless it was absolutely necessary, people used to march around city chambers trying to get her out of office. What does that mean in terms of leadership? She says she made a commitment to only doing things that have positive outcomes for children and young people. We're going to talk about how you can do this in your setting. What do we need to build in our culture? Glasgow pinned it on being a nurturing city. I think emotional safety is important. It's important that it's something bigger than behavior, because if you make this about behavior, as soon as behavior is tricky, you'll still have tricky behavior days, people will think it's not working. If you pin it to behavior, there will be some learners that present behaviors that seem too extreme to warrant a response that is calm and predictable. So being emotionally safe feels like something that can stay. Let's look at what we need to build in our culture. Next slide, please, Matt. Okay, so we're going to talk about building a culture that is rich in emotional safety, self-belief, trusted adults, opportunity, and hope. Emotional safety means knowing where you stand, feeling protected, knowing that your sense of self and emotional well-being isn't going to be compromised. Self-belief is believing that you have opportunity, the right, the potential that you deserve to achieve. Being a trusted adult, I'm afraid, is more than passing your DBS check. It's about delivering the same predictable, calm, and consistent responses. Opportunity isn't about field trips or how many books is in the library. It's about the opportunity to make a mistake and try again. And hope, probably the outcome of all of those, means that this work impacts our children and young people on the inside and gives them skills and resources and belief they need to support them in the future. So, to be emotionally safe, what we need to be able to do is hold boundaries without impacting the emotional well-being of our children and young people. We want to be able to make our expectations clear without compromising that sponge space. And to do that, we're going to rely on some rules and agreement. Many schools use ready, respectful, and safe, but let's think about how we use those to really breed that sense of emotional safety. What we want to get to is that even when behaviour is really tricky, the child in front of us, their sense of self, their sense of belonging and their worth is not compromised or attacked in any way. That means we want to be able to say, this behaviour breaks our rule about, and I need you to. Or this behaviour breaks our rule about, that means we need to. Behaviour agreement response is the structure we want to instill. But if we try and do that when we are dysregulated, when we are feeling frustrated and when emotions are high, we're going to really struggle. So how we get to that, how we make sure every adult can deliver that response is starting over here. So we're going to start training ourselves to lean on the rules by running all of our requests through our agreement. I need you to be ready, that means. I need you to be respectful, that means. I need you to be safe, so we can A or B. I need you to be ready so we can do this first or that first. It's about building the structure of behaviour, agreement, response. Now, using this, saying I need you to and running it through the rules or the agreement is not going to change the world, and it might not change learner behaviour. That's not what it's meant to do. It's meant to change us and our response. It's meant to train us to lean on the rules rather than going into the learner. We don't want to talk about choice. We don't want to shame them. We don't want to make it their responsibility. We want to talk about behaviour in line of our agreement and what we need to learn or do. Once we've done that, and I would do it for a couple of weeks because it takes time. Once we as individuals have learned to run through the agreement, then we're going to start noticing when children and young people are doing the right thing. The reason for this is that rope pickup. We want children and young people to understand that if they want their rope picked up here, you're going to do the right thing. That is how you're going to get my attention. So I've made it really clear what I expect. And now I'm going to show you that when you do the right thing, I'm going to pick the rope up. Thank you for being ready. That's exactly what I need. That's beautiful. That's really respectful. I'm really proud of you. I can see how hard you're working to be safe today. Thank you. Tiny little moments of attention, just noticing. You don't need to mark that with anything. If you've done those two things, you've changed yourself, you're training yourself to lean on the rules, you're shifting the culture so that we pick up the rope when children and young people do the right thing. You can then lean in on the nudge. Remember our rule about. And that will motivate the majority of your children and young people to adjust their behaviour. If the nudge isn't working for the majority of your learners, these two things haven't been done explicitly or consistently enough. If the nudge doesn't work, what we do then is follow our same processes, but rather than going to the child, rather than leading with emotion, rather than escalating, we do the loop around the agreement. This behavior is breaking our rule about, and we need to. I understand that, and yet we still need to be ready. That means we can do this first or that first. This behavior broke our rule, so we need to have a conversation about that. I need you to stay for 2 minutes so we can see how I can help you tomorrow. It means that we don't fall into that two-way street of relationships. It means our response is consistent and clear. And most importantly, it means that our children are going to know that they will not be shamed. When every adult follows this structure, children and young people begin to build some sponge space when they arrive at school. They will arrive and think, I'm safe here. They will come off high alert. And for some children, that will mean they're less dysregulated. For some children, it will mean there's less disruption in class. For some children, it means they will push themselves further. Some children, it will mean they just love learning more. Let's talk about how we build self-belief. So, I hate to break it to you, but we do not build self-belief with stickers. My daughter is a LSA now. She has a suite of stickers. There are sticky ones and fluffy ones and shiny ones and smelly ones. That's not how we do it. We don't need house points or tokens or money. There are some schools in the UK that pay for positive behaviour. I have seen children that can earn PlayStations and Nike Air Forces. What are we doing when we're recognising and rewarding? What's our objective? What we want to do is build the driver in children and young people that doing the right thing makes me feel good. We want to build an internal motivator, not dangle a golden carrot. What we don't want to do is build doing the right thing gets me something. That's a long bargain to maintain. It means that you need to be caught. What about when people don't notice? What about when it doesn't get me anything? It needs to be an inside job. So what we want to do is really mark the moment and then allow the feeling to go inside. Allow children and young people to feel pride. We skip that when we mask it with something. We miss that bit, that opportunity for learning, that doing the right thing makes me feel good, when actually we're getting kids to put a marble in the jar or giving them something of value. We want to mark that moment simply with some deliberate noticing that really enhances that feeling of pride. Of course, we can mark it with something, but a blank sticker that you write on is much more powerful than any of the stickers you buy. The paper bands that you can buy for festivals or clubs, you can write on those, write what the learner's done and let them wear it. For some schools I've been working with, they felt that they needed something to motivate. Well, you can have the paper bands blank, hang them on the board if you want, just a couple. Give them out every day so that people can see, but don't make it generic. What we're trying to capture is creating something that has more value to me than if I gave it to somebody else. So a branded, smelly sticker means as much to me as it would to somebody else in the playground. But a sticker that's got my name on and notice what I've done, a paper band that notices how I've improved, what I've been working really hard on, means loads more to me than it would to somebody else. If we're doing notes home, if we're doing positive notes, don't fall into the trap of making them shiny or branded. You don't need to pre-populate the child's name, what they've done. don't print your names. You don't have to write that. It needs to be as organic as possible. A post-it note does as much work as a shiny printed postcard. It needs to feel meaningful. We want to build that feeling, like I said, because that is what helps us build strong decision-making and resilience and self-belief. And children and young people that have high levels of self-belief fundamentally behave different to children that don't. I often used to think that children that have higher levels of self-belief behave differently. And that's true. But what is also important is our security around when we're going to get some more self-belief. So if you are a child that gets one good positive note a year, you're going to behave completely different to somebody that is praised and noticed every couple of days. Building self-belief should be a consistent effort. We should be doing it all of the time. And we need to do it not when children cross a line. It shouldn't be verbal bribery. It shouldn't be using praise to motivate. It's about catching effort and improvement and nudging children and young people along. That's right. Keep going. That's it. Let's go. I'm really proud of you. You can do it. It's not an up here. It's not who's going to sit nicely so I can give them a point. I don't want to fall into that. It doesn't do any of the heavy lifting for us. Any gains you get from those mechanisms are short-lived and doesn't teach our children and young people the skills they need to improve and develop and manage their behaviour over time. Okay, let's talk about being a trusted adult. This is really hard. Being calm and consistent and predictable, it's hard work. How are we going to help ourselves do that? So firstly, thinking about muscle memory is important. Our brain validates our feelings. So if I'm feeling angry with somebody, if I have a learner that pushes my buttons and makes me feel frustrated and resentful, my brain will give me evidence of why that feeling is right. It will embolden my response. We need to train ourselves to support our muscle memory to reset. So safety first in conversations and interactions play a role in helping us to be trusted, whilst also supporting that regulation and engagement of our children and young people. You can adjust without shaming. You know, last week when we had a great lesson, that's what I need to see from you today. Thank you. I loved how kind you were at lunchtime, but this behaviour is breaking our rule about being respectful, so I need you to. Speaking to your colleagues about what your triggers are. What do you look like when you're cool and calm and confident? What are the signs that you're starting to struggle? How can you ask for a 30-second breather or a 2-minute step outside so that you can re-regulate and come back and do the rest of the lesson or day at your best? Thinking about what might help you, thinking about how the displays can support your muscle memory and help you feel calm, whether that's capturing moments of success with tricky learners, making notes on the good days, making a win log or a victory log, showing what you've learned, your career development, putting it on the wall, even if it's just behind your desk. Keeping the thank you cards, the shout outs, the pictures, make sure you can see them and access them so that you can use them to support and ground yourself in the moments where you feel that you're becoming wobbly. Okay, let's talk about opportunity. This is tricky. It's about having the opportunity to make a mistake, to learn again next time. And that takes us as adults to understand that our job when we are issuing consequences is to say that behaviour wasn't okay. I'm going to help you behave differently next time. I'm going to look at what we could do tomorrow to make it better. It's forward facing. What we're doing is saying that crossed our boundary. Let's think about how we can do that differently. What do you need from me? How can I support you? What do we need to learn? It's not backwards facing. It's not saying, you did this awful thing and I'm going to make you feel terrible about that so you don't do that again. We want to avoid that. That's shaming and it can be harmful. So opportunity is about that forward facing consequence and conversation. Sometimes there are behaviours that will need a consequence, and making them fair and proportionate and forward facing makes them safe. It doesn't mean they should be the thing we go to all of the time. They should not be used as a threat. They should be delivered with dignity and purpose. The focus should be learning. But we can't always have a consequenceless system. We need to be able to teach children as well. The key part of lots of consequences is the conversation. So let's talk about how we do that effectively. The first thing is that we cannot have one conversation that does every job. We need to think about the role restoration plays in our culture. If restoration isn't part of our culture, we can't stick a conversation on the end of a system and expect it to work. We can't have 5 questions that solve every incident. And we need to think about how we deliver that consequence with safety so that it doesn't just become a verbal punishment. We can start by doing a restorative follow-up. I noticed you were struggling to be ready for learning today. Is there anything you need from me tomorrow? This can be used if a learner has had a wobbly start, if their behaviour has been disruptive in lesson, but you have reminded them and they've adjusted. We still want to remind them, 1, that their behaviour wasn't quite at our expected standard today, and 2, that we are there to help them have a better day tomorrow. Those 2 parts are really important if we want restorative work to be effective later down the line. 2, the more traditional restorative conversation. It's great if there is a clear opportunity for learning. It can work really well when there have been peer interactions or fallouts. I worry about some of the questions that lots of people will be using in restorative conversations because we want to still be really careful not to shame children. There is a difference between asking what happened and asking what we could do differently and asking what we've learnt to asking how you've made everybody feel. I worry that that is incredibly tricky to do without slipping into you've made people feel like this and therefore you should feel bad. So I would maybe leave that. That doesn't mean we can't teach empathy, but I feel like we should teach empathy when we are connected and safe and learning. When we're doing these restorative conversations, the environment, if we're sitting in an office, if it's the first time we've spoken to the lady that does the restorative conversations in our school, if we know it's because we've done something wrong, we're going to be on high alert. So adding that layer of potential shame is a risk too much to emotional safety. We just want to keep to forward facing, remember. What could we do differently? How could we put that right? What would you do differently next time? And we can't chase sorry. When we say sorry, we are completely vulnerable. We give our control to the other individual and wait for them to forgive us or say it's okay. That vulnerability will be too tricky for some children to manage, particularly those that are neurodiverse or trauma experienced. They can show they're sorry. They might put things right or do things differently by writing a letter, but they might offer to say sorry. But we can't say you need to say sorry now. These conversations, particularly when they're done after peer-to-peer conflict, should be done separately. Do not put one child in front of another. Do not make one a victim and one a perpetrator. Give them dignity and privacy to have their conversation, think about learning, and they might need to learn how to ask for help, how to communicate, how to ask for a break, how to find some space. All of those things are okay. Do those individually and then let them understand how they come back together and resolve things. Then the final restorative conversation or restorative piece of work is for the children and young people that do the same thing over and over. Let's not do the same restorative conversation over and over. Arguably, if it hasn't worked the first time, it's not going to. So my son, his behaviour has been tricky. We've had maybe 752 restorative conversations about him talking in lesson. I've made flow charts that have started with him having a job, being successful, having a nice car, which is a motivator for him, and have pulled it back to not talking in lesson. I have talked about it being disrespectful and disruptive. I have asked him, we have spoken about learning. None of those worked. So what do we do with those children and young people where you do the same conversation and don't seem to get anywhere? Well, I had probably swung to the other end of the pendulum with my son. I was not positively noticing or building his self-belief or being consistent. So we made some agreements, some adjustments at home. I'd introduced planned consequences. So when he got a detention for talking, we did 10 minutes of catch-up work at the table. It meant I didn't have to emotionally attend. I didn't have to stand at the door and say, when are you going to learn? Or I can't believe you've done it again. We'd made some improvements. I'd started noticing stuff he's good at. I shifted from the idea that I could only notice good things if he'd been good. I started realizing that they could exist together, that he could have had a detention for talking but still do a beautiful job of tidying up after dinner. He could have been tricky at school but been a really good brother to his younger sister when he got home. And I started building that narrative. But to talk about where we go with restorative conversations when that original format doesn't work, I'm going to talk about the phone call that I got probably 4 or 5 months into me trying these things at home about him watching porn in class. He had meant to get out his phone to do some Sparks maths. He had ended up on Babe Station or whatever the modern day equivalent is, and his teachers had him in the restorative conversation room. They had his phone and they needed me to go. They hadn't had the chat about don't ask how you've made people feel. And his answers were a bit off because they were talking about the maths teacher and he thought they were talking about the woman he'd been looking at on Babe Station. Now, when we left, not through understanding or expertise particularly, but because I didn't want to do a deep dive about my son watching porn in school, I didn't do the what happened, what could we do differently, what could we learn from this structure. If I'm being completely honest, I was exhausted. I'd spent a lot of time sitting on my front doorstep considering moving into the Premier Inn. So I just asked, like, what am I missing? What do you need? I was vulnerable. I didn't claim to have any answers. I was probably too exhausted to be really angry. And in that moment, because of all the work I'd done, because I'd put in those planned consequences, because I'd started positively noticing him, because I'd been calmer at home, he was able to tell me that he really wanted to be popular. And that's tricky for any 15-year-old. But my older children are adopted, not officially, They were buy one, get two free on Tinder, but they don't have a relationship with their birth mum, and they haven't for about 5 years. They had a very tricky start in life. And so, in that moment where I had surrendered and stopped chasing behavior and stopped going on about what was right and what was wrong and what he needed to do and what were we going to learn, just in that moment where we hold connection, he said, I want to be popular. And I'm already really weird because my mum doesn't love me. And that allowed me to really understand that sometimes some of this work, we've got to stop chasing behavior, leave the rules just for a minute, and find the children that need a moment to go a layer down and talk about what they need. For your vulnerable children, for your children that are navigating trauma experience, where do they find that? Where do they find that? And how do we hold their boundaries without constantly making feel like they can't trust us or they shouldn't be safe with us or that we don't believe in them enough to really want to know what they need? That's what opportunity means. And we've got to think about how we build that into our schools. Now, my final thing is about hope. Hanging on to hope, what that means. Because some children, their behavior will not change whilst you are working with them. There are some children that will be tricky and complex and vulnerable from when you meet them to when they move on. And if we behave in a way that shames and punishes and chips away at their self-belief and their sense of safety, we also take away their sense of hope. Some children who will be tricky all of the time, who you might not notice improvement, who you might not understand what this work is doing, will need that sense of emotional safety and self-belief and opportunity and hope long after you are supporting them. I know that because that was me. I was very lucky that I had access to emotional safety, self-belief, trusted adults, and opportunity before my trauma experience changed the future of what my life looked like. When I needed it, when I was sectioned about 15 years ago, when I needed the voice to say, you can do this, you can get better, you can recover, you can make those mistakes and learn from them. I had that in me because I came in a wrapper that allowed adults to be sympathetic and understanding. I had had the experience before I was in a road accident when I was 15. But what do we do about the children and young people that don't come in a wrapper that's easy to understand, whose trauma experience isn't clear, that doesn't make us feel sympathetic? Because those children need hope too. So when we are holding boundaries and teaching behavior, we have to do it in a way that is emotionally safe, that allows children and young people to develop the qualities they need and ensure they hang on to hope into the future. This work isn't easy, and we teach and support adults to learn these skills bit by bit over time. If you need me, I am on charlotte@letusnavigate.com. I hope this has been helpful and hope to hear from you soon.